Hello and welcome to lecture number 6. Today's topic will be the 1920s and the Great Depression. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we'll explore some of the aspects of the Roaring Twenties, that decade of the 1920s. But what we'll also see is that 10-year time period was not necessarily roaring or a great time for everyone. Then we'll explore the Great Depression. First, we'll address the human toll, then the New Deal program sponsored by Franklin Roosevelt, but we'll also focus on the impact of the Great Depression on the state of Michigan. Let's begin with some of the popular images associated with the 1920s. If you were to look at several aspects of the decade's economy, you would see that there was an economic boom as the U.S. economy prospered. On the left, you see a chart identifying the industrial production as it grew during the decade. On the right, you see some aspects of the stock market, which also grew. Now, the image here and some of the statistics that you can see are a little bit of repeat, but in many ways, Michigan became an urban state as a result of the expansion of people's access to automobiles. Automobiles became cheaper, and the number of registered cars ballooned. And you can see those statistics on the left. The cover of Life magazine is shown here on the 150th anniversary of our country. In many ways, the decade of the 20s was full of fun and heroes. Here we see some images of the fun and heroic aspects of the decade. On the bottom left, we see a radio receiver. By the end of the decade, more than half of American homes had a radio. In the upper right, we see Al Jolson, who participated in the first talking movie in 1927, named The Jazz Singer. On the bottom right, we see a celebration of American music, and particularly the expansion of jazz. And in the upper left, we see a young baseball player, Babe Ruth. In 1920, his first full year with the New York Yankees, he hit 54 home runs, more than any other team combined. We see a transformation in many women's roles as the flapper image became quite common. The flapper was an independent young woman. Here's a statistic. About 1 out of every 4 women worked outside the home during the 1920s, often for less pay than their male counterparts. Flappers were young women with bobbed hair, a short skirt, maybe a cigarette hanging from her mouth, and they actually openly discussed sex and drank alcohol. On the left, we see a political cartoon lamenting many of the changes in American society. Many Americans also became lawbreakers during the decade, as prohibition was the law of the land, and many ignored these laws. In many ways, Michigan was at the forefront of issues involving prohibition because of its proximity to Canada. Again, here's a statistic. About a quarter of the annual budget used to enforce prohibition was spent in our state alone. We'll make one final link back to Justice Stearns. By the 19-teens and 1920s, Stearns operated the Stearns Motor Manufacturing Company, which produced a lot of engines for boats. Apparently, these engines were sought after by rum runners because they were so fast they could outrun the Coast Guard. While the 1920s was a fun decade for some, for others, it wasn't. And we see the rise of nativism. Next, we'll explore the other side of the 1920s and show how it wasn't roaring for all Americans. I'd like to start with the story of an individual. On the left, we see Dr. Ossian Sweet. He was born to the South to parents who were sharecroppers. He worked hard, and he was able to pay his way through college. Then Dr. Sweet purchased a home in a middle-class Detroit neighborhood. But he was black, and this was an all-white neighborhood. Housing in the city of Detroit and through much of America at the time was segregated. African Americans were relegated to an area of Detroit called Black Bottom. In May 1925, a mob of whites began to attack the home in order to pressure him to leave. The home itself is still standing, and it's shown here. Dr. Sweet had gathered a small group of friends in order to help defend the home. As the mob attacked the house, shots were fired from an upstairs window. One man was killed and another injured. Everyone in the house was arrested and put on trial for murder. These were called the Sweet trials. Eventually, Sweet and his associates were acquitted of murder, but it demonstrates the racial tension that was apparent in Detroit and how segregation was commonplace in many northern cities. The decade also saw the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Originally, it had formed in the years after the Civil War. However, by the 1920s, there were between 2 and 5 million members throughout the country. Their motto in that decade was 100% Americanism, whatever that means. It was pro-white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. It was anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, and anti-foreigner. It wasn't simply against African Americans. In Michigan, it was strongest in large cities like Detroit and Flint. The Ku Klux Klan originated in the American South, but in the 1920s, several northern states had very large chapters. Here we see some examples of some KKK rallies in the state of Michigan. Over 200 KKK units were spread throughout the state, and 64 out of 83 of Michigan's counties had chapters. There was also a local presence. Here we see a KKK march after one of their members died in the community of Hart. They're just parading down the main street in Hart, and you can see that on the left. In years past, I did some research and I explored a Ku Klux Klan constitution, and they have a mission statement. They were dedicated to Almighty God, the teachings of Jesus Christ our Lord, the United States of America, and the maintenance of white supremacy. The Ku Klux Klan is a homegrown, American, Christian, terrorist organization. The Ku Klux Klan also supported a range of political figures. Here we see Charles Bowles, who served as the mayor of Detroit for a short time in 1930. He wasn't a member of the Ku Klux Klan, but members of the KKK openly supported his candidacy. Next, I'd like to look at the decade of the 1930s and the Great Depression. Here we see a headline from the New York Times in October of 1929, and the stock market crash. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression, but it was an indicator as to many of the problems associated with the American economy. Here, I'd like to show some statistics that address unemployment rates as well as kind of the depth of the Great Depression. In 1929, 5 million autos were built. Just 3 years later, only 1.3 were made. Michigan was impacted horribly by the Great Depression. The auto industry was very important. Unemployment rates nationwide were 25%. In the state of Michigan, it was nearly double that at 46%. Here we see some images associated with the decade. On the left, we see several men at a soup kitchen getting a free meal. On the right, we see a man who's created a home for himself from scrap wood. The banking industry had major problems during the decade. Between 1929 and 1934, 25% of the banks in the state of Michigan closed. If your bank closed and you had money in it, you couldn't get it back. that bank went bankrupt and you lost your money. One bank that didn't go bankrupt in the decade is shown here. On the left, we see Lake Osceola State Bank. This image is from 1910, and it weathered the storms of the 1930s. It's still in place today, and we see an image of the bank on the right. This one's located in Baldwin, just down the street from Jones Ice Cream. Next, we'll explore a group similar to the Ku Klux Klan that emerged during the decade. The image here shows members of the Black Legion. This was a nativist organization similar to the Ku Klux Klan that rose in prominence in the state of Michigan. There probably were about 200,000 members in the state during the 1930s. They came about because whites were looking at a scapegoat for all of their economic problems. They stood for white, native-born, Protestant, 100% Americanism, and were linked to as many as 100 murders. African Americans in particular were targets of harassment as well as violence in the decade. The Black Legion was investigated for some of their activities, and they sent the police in a letter, and you can see an image of this below on the left saying, hey, back off, don't investigate us. The Black Legion was so prominent that it was featured in a film starring Humphrey Bogart, and you can see that on the right. Evidence continued to mount against the Legion members, and you can see that several were accused of murder and fingerprinted in the image on the left. Eventually, leadership of the organization was convicted of murder. Although the Black Legion rose and fell very quickly in the 1930s, it disappeared as a group. However, the attitudes of its members often remained and demonstrated the racial tension commonplace throughout the state of Michigan in that decade. Now that we've explored some of the unemployment rates and background to the Great Depression, I'd like to talk about a program developed by the government to try to fight the Great Depression. The image here shows the president throughout much of the Great Depression. His initials are FDR. His name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was in office between 1933 and 1935. Interestingly, Michigan had been a very deep stronghold of the Republican Party. FDR was a Democrat, and even Michigan went for this Democratic candidate in 1932. Here we see Franklin Roosevelt delivering one of his famous fireside chats as he used the radio to try to announce to the American people his program. His goal was to provide the American people with a so-called New Deal, a plan to end the Great Depression. See, what had happened is that local communities couldn't address a lot of the suffering of their members, and so they begged the national government for help. Roosevelt oversaw the creation of several new government agencies designed to try to help end the Great Depression. While it didn't end the Depression, it eased many of the suffering of average Americans. I'll identify just a couple of New Deal programs. The first is shown here. This is the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. This was a huge government agency with a budget of about $11 billion. It employed over 8 million people. They were engaged in a range of many different programs. They built about 125,000 buildings, buildings such as hospitals, schools, post offices, government buildings, things like that. And money for the arts also was allocated, as it employed writers, performers, artists, and many people associated with the arts. If local communities were able to provide part of the funding for construction projects, the federal government provided the rest. Plumbers, architects, electricians, and just average workers were employed building things like this Saginaw City Hall, or a new high school in Detroit. Artists were contracted in order to paint murals in different areas, in public buildings. On the left, we see some local post offices. In Alma, Michigan, we see the one at the top. Farming was really important. So there's a mural there celebrating the farming industry. In Calumet, Michigan, mining was important. So you see a mural identifying that there. And then you see a public school library on the right at Dearborn honoring Native Americans. Another government agency was the CCC, which stood for the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was one of Roosevelt's favorite programs because it put men to work and helped the environment at the same time. They were engaged in many different programs. They planted trees, built campgrounds, hiking trails, things like that. You didn't get rich working for the CCC. Average pay was $35 a month, but you had 3 square meals and a roof over your head, even if you worked 6 days a week, 10-hour days often. Here we see some images associated with the Civilian Conservation Corps. On the left, you see the exterior and interior of some government buildings. You didn't live rich if you were in a CCC camp. Also, on the right, we see some of the hard work that many of these Corps members were engaged with. This historical marker off of M55 in between Manistee and Cadillac identifies the impact of the CCC in the state of Michigan. There were over 57 camps in Michigan where they employed nearly 95,000 men who planted 485 million trees, constructed over 7,000 miles of roads, and stocked over 150 million fish. The CCC had a huge impact on the state of Michigan. The legacy is still seen today. Here we see a local example. Does anybody know where I'm standing? Well, that's at Ludington State Park. The CCC provided the labor pool to expand Ludington's State Park. Here we see another example of the legacy of the New Deal and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Are you familiar with this? Well, this is Orchard Beach State Park in Manistee. Both of these state parks continue to generate revenue for the tourism industry in Manistee as well as Mason counties. They have a huge impact on the U.S. and our state today. The last topic for today deals with labor unions. The 1930s saw a lot of conflict between laborers and unions, and you see some images of UAW workers on the left. Up until the 1920s, labor unions really were not very large or powerful. Things changed with the tremendous number of layoffs during the Great Depression. The United Auto Workers sought recognition for the union. Their hope was to try to get better wages, working conditions, and some level of job security, but the auto industry executives refused to recognize them. Things came to a head in the 1930s when employees at General Motors staged a strike. This wasn't the first strike in American history. However, they engaged in what was called a sit-down strike beginning in December of 1937. They refused to leave the facility or work. Their goal was to gain recognition of the union and improve wages. Initially, administrators for the company refused to recognize the employees. However, after about 6 weeks, each side compromised. General Motors agreed to recognize the union, and the union members didn't receive the wage increases that they hoped, but they did receive some. Well, let's review some of the highlights of today's presentation. Well, there were two main focal points for today's presentation. The first was the 1920s. In many ways, it was a roaring decade for some, but not for everyone. You should be able to identify some of the traits of the American economy and aspects of the fun and heroic times in the decade. But also, you should be able to recognize the limitations as well. The 1930s saw the greatest economic crisis in American history. You should be familiar with the human toll as well as some of the programs developed to fight the Depression. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care and have a great day.